Thank you for choosing the Minority Alliance Organization meeting this week. We will be covering a few different topics here. One will be some of the executive orders that we've been seeing from the new Biden administration. And we will also talk about complacency in the minority community. And starting in, talking about the executive orders we've been seeing, obviously, as is the thing with new administrations, there's a lot of executive orders that are going in. Some are meant to, go after specific policies of previous administration. Some are meant to be legacy defining executive orders to kind of establish a footing. And what we've noticed with some of the executive orders being signed by President Biden, and in these first few days, we are now 1 week into that administration. Specifically, there were a couple that stood out, and some of the ones that were signed speaking on equality and racial equality. We had a few ones that stood out. There was a few in here that they were talking about when it came to denouncing some of the anti-Asian bias that we're seeing in the country, when it came to reaffirming tribal sovereignty, and that was also bolstered by stopping the pipeline that was going through some of their land. But a couple of things that I wanted to touch on. One of those orders in particular was in redressing the racism in housing urban development when it comes to federal housing policy. As I dug into this a little bit more, I actually saw a really amazing quote that they put out in the press release about this executive order, and I'll actually read directly from that particular memo. It says, we will make clear we have to acknowledge the role that the federal government has played through much of the 20th century in implementing discriminatory housing policies across the U.S., from redlining to mortgage discrimination. Now, as executive orders go, executive orders, again, they're meant to be splashy. They're not laws, they're recommendations. Sometimes executive orders become law, sometimes executive orders become running policy that people run with for at least the time being, until someone attempts to either block it through the courts or someone attempts to go ahead and make it a law. What I like about a quote like that is that for the first time that I can remember, you have an entity of the federal government really admitting and putting out there in public that, these discriminatory practices were implemented on the federal level. And these sort of things that were meant to keep people from getting into neighborhoods they didn't want them to go, from getting their hands on funding that they didn't want them to have, the kind of warehousing and pinning into sprawling urban environments and specific sections of those urban environments for minorities was something that was not just planned on the business level, it was planned on the federal level. And by putting that out there and falling on the sword and admitting that and actually making some effort to change that, I think is actually a really good step in the right direction, because if nothing else, it's important that people really know that they acknowledge that this was a real thing. This is happening. It wasn't we've known it forever, but it wasn't, in our imagination, it wasn't our opinion that it was happening. It was a fact. And by acknowledging that this is a fact, that actually gets us into that first step towards actually being able to change that. Because again, the first step of the equality is respect, the equal amount of respect that we get, and being able to have the same opportunity to live where I want, and to, be able to make a living for my family and buy a home and own some property and become a part of the economy and a part of the system as much as anyone else, regardless of what my skin color is and regardless of what my background is. That's a true step toward, equality. So I think that actually, though it is not a law, at least not yet, it is actually a step in the right direction. So Colin, I wanted to kick it over to you to kind of get some of your ideas and thoughts behind, some of these orders that you're seeing.
Now, I'll say on my end, the biggest thing that I took away from Biden executive orders, and as I said, how I feel personally, about the Biden administration, between me and you, we've had a couple conversations, and I said, starting out, the biggest things that I wanted to see was him attack within the first few weeks. These issues that we're starting to see him already uh, basically put on the board to get checked off currently. Um, Way I look at it is, I think Biden, this was one of the smartest moves that we've seen of the use of executive orders. Probably since the Obama administration, when they initially became a big thing, when people actually started using executive orders as as much as they do currently. Um, but Biden's executive orders was not, it wasn't necessarily legislation. And I think that comes from, his history of being a senator, and him being able to word these things in a way where they're not, so much legislation. It leaves the room for policymakers to create policies that fit these agendas, are more so what his executive orders are. These are getting the agenda on the board, and creating kind of an outline for us to work within the agenda to get these things handled, which I really appreciate that from, as I said, initially, I'm not, you know, I personally was sitting back waiting to see what Biden would do in the first few days to show his gratitude towards especially the minority community, with people getting out and actually voting and being able to help swing that vote uh, towards more so the blue, for Biden to be able to get into office and see the progression that we've actually been fighting for. Um, One thing you noted on was the housing policy. Basically, he put out an executive order to go back and do an evaluation of the prior policy under Trump's administration. And I mean, even more so, just looking at the federal policy behind housing requirements, period, overall, and seeing how that has affected minorities in different communities, of being able to meet certain requirements to make it into certain housing areas and things of that nature, which I think is huge when you speak on the minority community, and us being able to actually create better housing opportunities, as you said, especially already for a single American. Is very difficult to be a single homeowner while being a single person American, as is now. Even being a minority single American, it becomes a even harder situation. So it seems, there is a bar. It seems, as you said, with redlining, there has been a bar and certain limits that have been put on certain minorities and certain communities of being able to get housing in those communities and things of that nature. So we hope that, those issues can be found by these committees, and we can see a change of impact within the housing sector and the housing policy overall, to create equality for everyone across the board in that area. Um, Another thing you touched on, when it comes to minorities, even further than African American minorities, a couple things that I pulled out was the travel ban, the undocumented immigrants uh, actually being counted in the census, which is really huge per minorities, because that allows us a better opportunity next time it comes around time to vote. And actually, if we can get the people who are undocumented currently to start working towards their citizenship, this helps to create a equal playing field when it does come to the voting process later on. And all of that starts with actually doing the census and everybody being counted across the board. If you're a human being and you breathe, you should be counted within the census. So there was an executive order to have that actually handled. Um, his executive order on anti-Asian discrimination and xenophobia that a lot of people were experiencing per COVID, and due to the COVID crisis, people had been going out and harassing uh, Asian Americans that didn't deserve that. So I think that they're putting out great agenda and plans to act within, setting out all these things. And I mean, even as far as the last one I'm gonna go to, before I know you want to speak on federal prison, I'm gonna let you open up into that before I speak on it a little bit. But his handling of COVID right off back with executive orders within, it hasn't even been a full week. I believe today makes full 7 days transition of power. And, just the executive orders that he's laid out so far, to me, it looks like a great agenda to actually start off on, a great foot to start off on, to give policymakers basically a blueprint and an outline to work within on policies that they should be focusing on in the current administration.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I think that the most important thing for them to put out with these executive orders are two things. The first thing being that you want to be able to look back and reach back and let people know that this wasn't a pandering campaign. This wasn't a campaign of, hey, I'm gonna get all the minority groups and reach out to them, and once they vote for me, I'm gonna go back to business as usual. This is actually a step in the right direction from the picking of the cabinet and the demographic of the picking of the cabinet being not only qualified individuals, but individuals of color and individuals from these diverse backgrounds. To have a cabinet that looks like America to work for America is a huge thing. And it shows that you can have faith that it isn't just a pandering campaign where we're just going to go right back to business as usual. The second thing to it, and it's really the power of executive orders overall, since they are not legislation, what they do besides just putting out their agenda, it puts pressure. It applies pressure to lawmakers to say that this is the agenda that we're working towards, and you're going to have to make a stand on whether you're actually for it or against it. And you're going to have to actually be able to put your legislative vote, and an actual policy behind, whether you're going to stand with an agenda like this or against an agenda like this. And by putting this out there, that we're looking to redress some of these issues that have plagued these communities for so long, that it really puts people in a position where you have to make a choice. You're going to have to decide, I'm either going to have to publicly stand against this, or I'm going to publicly be for it and actually make some movement on it. So there actually is there's some good things that can come from executive orders like this, even initially, especially establishing them so early. And amongst those executive orders, which is a really important one that I was looking at, is the federal defunding, basically, of private prisons. As I dug into this a little bit, and as any minority is well aware, that the private prison industry is a very big money making profit institution. And just looking at it right now, we have the largest prison population in the world. 2.1 million people at any given time right now is locked up between the actual penal system and in county and city jails. And when you look at that, I mean, the private prison system is a smaller portion of that. And it's a little more than 116,000 right now, as of the latest statistics. However, that number has been growing and growing and growing as the actual prison population over the last 10 years has actually shrank, which means that the incarceration of people going into private prisons is actually more and more so a supply and demand kind of situation, where you have these companies that are making so much money. I mean, just in the last year, well, actually the statistics for 2020 haven't come out yet, but statistics for 2019, there was $4.8 billion going through the private prison industry, with a pure profit, pure clear of all cost profit of $629 million. That's a lot of money tied up in the incarceration of individuals. So, and as we look across there, this is just huge when it comes to what it does to the minority community, for Black and brown Americans that are being locked up, and then even for immigrants. Right now, 75% of all immigrant incarceration is currently taking place in private prisons. So when we look at that, and you see that over the last 10 years, that the incarceration overall of the population for African Americans has dropped 24%. No, I'm sorry, 29%, actually. 24% for Hispanic and 12% for Caucasian. So you see overall incarcerations as marijuana becomes legal in more and more places and certain things, you see the overall incarceration in regular prisons beginning to decline, but you see the incarcerations in private prisons go up. So there's definitely a problem there. And, again, the pressure that it puts on those individuals, there are 28% higher incidents of inmate on inmate assault in private prisons as opposed to regular run prisons. There was a double the amount of inmate on staff violence in private prisons as to regular prisons. So there's definitely not only because they are free of the type of regulatory restrictions that you see with regularly run government prisons. You see this absence, this neglect when it comes to staffing, training, the implementation of policy, and all those different things come from the fact that it is a profit institution. Nobody makes money spending money. So, there's definitely a right step in, taking the federal government out of this and, beginning to not fund it and not support that level, that type of incarceration and that type of business making model. And what it does is by putting pressure, of course, the federal government can't control what the states do when it comes to private prisons. States can still run private prisons if they want to, but the pressure that it puts on them is taking federal money out of the equation. It'll also take away the state's ability to get federal funding that will then be used into that private prison circulatory system. And again, this is one of the things where states' rights will come back to bite them because states are not allowed to run deficits. Only the government is. So, if you're not getting federal money to run a private prison, you're definitely not going to be expanding that private prison system because where are you getting that money? Because you have to hit your budget no matter what. And that's going to be, a huge thing. So again, an executive order like this, though not a law, it exerts a pressure that will eventually reverberate back down through the states when it comes to the private prison system. So again, I'll kick it back over to you. I wanted to see, kind of what your thoughts on that were.
No, I'll say when it comes to privatization of prisons, that there is a benefit in it in having private prisons. For the same benefit is the same downfall that you actually gave. Um, certain private prisons, you do have certain caveats offered to you that you may not get at a state, or a lot of the states, the reason why they moved into privatization prisons is because a lot of the states weren't able to actually fund the upkeep of the inmates and the level of quality of living that they needed, the type of food, things of that nature. The states were falling behind on being able to handle the actual cost of these things, and that's when you saw the uh, private sector move in and start, offering to front the money for these certain prisons and different things of that nature. So there was a benefit in doing it initially. And now the downfalls that you have listed, I definitely agree with, in the sense of I think this was a great start, but we shouldn't just be even looking at private prisons in this nature. We should be looking at the entire system. And I think more so that's what this executive order was a preamble of. It was saying we're going to go in and we're going to look at the prison system, period. I think he just said federal prisons initially because, as I said, I think Biden, as being a senator for years and being able to know legislator, he didn't try to overstep his boundary as far as his authority over certain states and their sovereignty, which I definitely, I appreciate that in this sense of the way that he's been wording all of his executive orders. And he's been doing things on the federal level to get them started, and we hope to see, as they say, the trickle down effect in business. We hope to see the trickle down effect in government and governmental policy, and that these policies that we're seeing being enacted at the federal level will eventually trickle down into the state levels and actually be passed at a state level. so that we're actually looking at, as you said, I think that's a great step as far as the prison system. But uh, I think him starting with federal prisons, yeah, is good in private prisons, but we've got to look more in depth at the prison system in general, especially at these state ran prisons, because certain state ran prisons are, certain ones are worse off than you would think the private prisons are, and things of that nature. And it being those are things that affect the minority uh, community directly, being that what's the number of African American men incarcerated in the judicial system? I believe the offset is what, like 39,
Yep.
38%, 37. It's somewhere around between 39 and 37 last time I checked. Versus when you look at the population, we don't make up but 15% of the population, but yet we're seeing our numbers incarcerated in that aspect. So you lose a lot more minorities in your community that end up within the judicial system and things of that nature. So that is something that we will continue to attack. We'll continue to keep an eye on how this policy unfolds and this legislation goes forward, and continue to push for these things to be handled at the state level and all around, because these are things that are affecting minorities every day. That we're glad to see uh, a president step up, something that we haven't seen over the past 4 years, and actually get to work in creating executive orders and getting people looking at the policies that we need to handle ahead of time. So within 7 days, it's not much bad I could say, other than keep keep up the good work type deal when we take a real look at the total Biden administration and things that they've been able to complete so far and get together.
Yeah, absolutely. I would echo that by saying that you're absolutely right. Dealing with some of the federal funding in private prisons is a step, but this is a very large pie, right? There's a lot of issues that need to be handled. There's a lot of issues when it comes to the type of actual reform, because this is not a prison reform executive order. That still needs to come. And the goal that I think for us, as far as being observers of what's going on with what with these executive orders and with some of the steps that they are going in the right direction, but what we cannot do is allow ourselves to get satisfied or complacent. And speaking of being satisfied and complacent, this would bring us into our second topic of the day, which is when we are looking at the overall health of the minority community and what we are looking for and what we're going after. We have seen a lot of different things that have happened over the course of just the last year itself, and the explosion of the protests and some of the George Floyd, Jacob Blake, Breonna Taylor, and some of the many others, and the anger and the passion and the fury and the need for change that we've looked at and we've looked for. It ignited something that we haven't seen since the 1960s, in feeding the winds of change. And now, we've seen some of that change. I mean, we've had, a complete flip in, our governance, and we're seeing that it has started to happen. But some time has passed since, last summer, and, just the general feeling that you feel about and where people are on things, and how we're talking about it, the amount of energy that's going into a lot of things that we're seeing out there in the world, you could definitely feel there's a little bit of a complacency in what we're asking for and what people are passionate about. The number of people who are speaking on issues, the number of people who are participating in issues, the number of people who are doing more and more of these things that we saw during the summer and during the fall of last year. It's starting to wane a little bit. Um, I think that that comes from being in a society that is very, very oriented on instant gratification. We're used to picking up a phone and having anything that we want to eat being delivered here within the next hour. We don't even have to see the money exchange. We're an instant gratification society now. We get that gratification through our social media. We get that gratification through our banking, through our, how we do everything. So I think that there's kind of a complacency about something more tangible and realistic when it comes, things like this, because that instant gratification isn't there. The long game isn't as appealing as the short fix. And therefore it loses some of its steam and that fire has to continuously be stoked. So, just to kind of probe your mind a little bit when it comes to that complacency, because again, this is just one person's opinion, and it's just one person's feeling on the subject of, not wanting that level of passion and need for change to subside, because we're not there yet. Only a few steps have been taken to, to start heading in this direction, but there's still a long way to go, and this could go back, in a very dark direction really, really fast if we're not vigilant and taking care of things. So I wanted to probe your mind on, how you're feeling about kind of the state of where people are at on, these minority issues right now.
And I mean, the way you said it was excellent in itself. But I mean, even looking at it more deeply for me, uh, watching how the young generation, especially, were getting out in high numbers, and the social media buzz behind the topic of equality was so huge last year around the summertime, and everybody was an activist at this time, and it seems the people who cared uh prior to last summer are the people who still care now, and the people who were activists prior to last summer are still activists now. It's you had the wave of the people where it became a popularity type of thing to go out and protest, and I think it was more so like a wave that it created, that people just wanted to get on board and felt like, oh yeah, well now it's something that they wanted to be heard. And now that things have sort of calmed down in a sense, even though they haven't. Not much has changed. As you said, me and you keep an eye on the news constantly, and there's still people losing their lives, across the country. There's still chaos within minority communities across the country. As far as gun violence is, I believe, at its all-time high. Um, since about the summer of last year. If you're looking at the numbers between the summer of last year and this year, it's been more gun violence deaths that we've seen than in the past 3 years total, I believe, within a few months, to say. So, especially within our own communities, uh, we can't be activists when it's cool on social media or when it's a popular thing to do. We gotta maintain an eye on the things that we are wanting to see across the board, and not just that, within our communities, continue to make the effort to make changes where we see fit in the areas that we can control, to make a better situation for uh, minorities and people within minority communities. When looking at last year and the huge turnout that we were seeing at a lot of these protests and a lot of these events, we don't seem to be seeing those numbers as far as when it goes to conversations now that we're having online. The conversations have drifted away from the political talks, away from the equality talks, to back to what it was before, where it seems nobody was paying attention to these things. Like, uh, the more complacent we become, we'll just start to see uh, the story narrated for us. And as a community, we will be handed uh, more so policies and things of that nature, to where somebody thinks these policies suits us and they fit us, unless we get out and we direct and narrate our own policies ourselves. Um, the biggest thing for me, Mark, we were talking about MLK, I believe, last week with his birthday. And the biggest thing out in this generation is we don't see those people who are bold and outspoken in that sense and continue to keep that fire that we saw with the MLK, with the Malcolm X, who basically the both of them went to their grave fighting the same fight. Um, it seems you don't see that passion really anymore, and you don't see that leadership within the movement. And I believe that's why the movement is, it'll pop up. There's an event that occurs and people go out and protest. There's something that has to happen to get us out there in the streets and making our voices heard and making things known where there are issues at. You can't wait for the situation to occur anymore. We have to be proactive within our own story and within our own narration of our minority communities of America and pushing towards a sense of equality for everyone across the board, which is, as far as us two, we have these talks constantly, and that's two things that we constantly are trying to find avenues and ways that we can get the community more involved in things that we can continue the conversation beyond just the election cycle. Let's continue the conversation on and continue the work that we started last year. Is the only thing that we've been focused on getting done.
Absolutely. I've spoken on it before, where I speak on the four zones of activism. You know, taking care of yourself, taking care of your family, taking care of your community, and then taking care of your country. You know, going back to step number one, which is the self. You know, we need to be able to ask ourselves um, a question that doesn't seem complex, but it's actually a little bit complex, which is, you know, what are you an activist for? What is important to you as a minority or a person, even if you're not a minority, but you see the cause and the things that are going through minorities, and you want to be able to help? You know, what is it? What can you see in yourself that energizes you? What are you passionate about? What do you see of the many subjects that are out there that affect minorities and their communities? What is it that is the most passionate to you? And being able to articulate that. How do you articulate that? How do you satisfy that passion and that rage against that inequality that you've personally seen? And again, no one's asking you to cross the Edmund Pettus Bridge, right? I mean, the ones who cross that bridge so you and I don't have to, right? But it is now on us, since they did what they did. They laid down their lives. They laid across that live wire for us to walk across to get to this point here. So for us now, where there's so many more of us now, where we have so much more technology, so much more ability to reach out and communicate, so many more people whose lives we can touch. You know, it becomes like, okay, well, what are you passionate about? What can you touch? Can you touch another person? Can those people touch another person? Can we get involved with more and more things? You know, we have people out there who are trying to rev up minority spending power, minority economics, trying to start banks and trying to get real financial power and authority over their own, over their systems. There are people who are starting up local businesses and, being able to afford them the same type of leeway to stumble out of the blocks and to become and establish themselves the way we've afforded those same privileges to the Walmarts and the Targets of the world, and being able to support those businesses getting up off the ground. That's a form of activism. That's a form of bringing buying power, spending power to something that is local, something that is in your community and able to help your community, and being able to rise those things up. So we may not have to do it the way that it was done by those pioneers. Don't get me wrong. There are fights we got to fight, and there's fights that we cannot sit back on, but there are also even more localized, even smaller ways. There are more things that we can do by continuing to push these things. We see something that really, really speaks to it, being able to elevate those things, use the power of social media, use the power of technology, and again, be able to elevate these things and use the words of the nation, or what the nation is supposed to be, and use it not necessarily against itself, but as a reminder to itself that we are supposed to be equal, that we are all supposed to be on the same plane, that we are all supposed to, get a part of these things, and that these aren't just words and they don't just qualify to one set of people. and they don't qualify to one religion. They don't qualify to one color. And making sure that we continuously remind ourselves, continuously remind our families, continuously remind our community, and continuously remind our country. So what I would say, and I'll kick it over to you for the last word. What I would say is, as we move forward and we see format changes and things that we'll do, in the group, in the organization, to push it forward, to include even more people, to bring more people under the tent. That is a question that is out there for every single member and every single person, which is, what is it that is passionate about this to you? What motivated you? What brought you here? What are you seeing? And these are the sort of things that we can take these issues, bring it to air. We can bring it out there to people. We can put it out on the different message boards. We can put it out there and start really activating brains and activating hearts, and really start moving this community along. So, again, as I always say with these things, we need to make sure we take care of each other, make sure we do not lose this momentum that we have, continue to hold these people accountable, continue to look for what we're looking for. And so I will kick it over to you. What do you think, as we move forward, we can do to really push that passion forward?
I mean, with the things that you stated that we've already been discussing about how we could bring more people within the group to continue the excitement that we found in the information of learning, there's a huge opportunity going forward with the revelation that was made last year over the summer, that these communities, you have communities where people are ready to see change, and people are positioned to see change and see that change implemented. Um, as you said, with people getting out and supporting, minority-owned businesses, especially during the period of COVID, as we continue to say, it's been one of the hardest hitting times for businesses across the board, but especially within minority communities. You have businesses that were barely hanging on by a thread, that could still use the support. If that's how you show your activism, or if that's how you show your support, is by getting out and going to buy a meal at a restaurant, going and spending money with one of these businesses to make sure that they can stay afloat through this process and be able to rebound post COVID. That's perfect for us. That those are the things that we try to keep a spotlight on. I know if there's businesses that come to us, minority-owned businesses that uh, come speak to us and help us put a spotlight of them through the group, or businesses that we research or come about. Uh, we just really want to see people across the community as with the group. That's what we really see this as, more so than anything. Is built as a nonprofit organization, but it's just a community in a sense of us all coming together and working towards the same goals, and building that together, and watching equality uh, being equality being progressed throughout the nation together, and being on this adventure of fighting for equality together. And it's a great thing because we're actually starting to see the tide turn, and we're starting to see things, especially as we just read today with a lot of the executive orders that Biden has started to establish. We're starting to see a lot of the change occur and happen. So it's on us to continue being, as I said, supporters of people within our own communities and businesses within our own communities, and uplifting one another, and making sure we keep the fire lit behind one another until we feel that our goals have been reached, and everybody throughout this whole nation, has feels a sense of equality in every aspect, every field.
Absolutely. Last thing I would say is, make sure, everybody, we need to continue to keep up our passion and keep up our organization. Those who do not want to see you get here, they're organized. Those who don't want to see you succeed, they're passionate. So if nothing else, we got to match that passion and make sure that they understand we are here to stay. We're not going anywhere, and we're going to get more than that. So Everybody take care. We'll see you guys next week.